Apologies for a short delay, but I think we're all here. And once again, hello and good evening, everyone. I hope everybody's enjoying the conference. Day 2 of YLMP 2021 is really drawing to a close, but not really, because what's ahead of us is very, very exciting. It's a YLMP 2021 special event. And before we'll introduce our speaker, I'd like to welcome our guest, our distinguished guest, who kindly accepted our invitation to this event. I hope all of them are with us. So my welcome goes to Professor Rafał Witkowski, AMU Vice Rector for International Cooperation, and also my colleagues, deans, Professor Tomasz Mizerkiewicz, Dean of the Faculty of Polish and Classical Philology, and also Dean Krzysztof Stroński, Dean of the Faculty of Modern Languages and Literatures. I also welcome, hoping again they are with us, or they'll be joining us very soon, my dear colleagues, Vice Deans of the Faculty of English, at the Faculty of English, Professors Jacek Fabiszak, Radosław Dylewski, and Piotr Gąsiorowski. And my very warm welcome goes to Ms. Justyna Janiszewska, Executive Director at the Fulbright Poland. It's always great to have Madam Director with us, and again, a very warm welcome. And also, I'm happy Dorota Jaworska-Pasterska is with us, and maybe Łukasz Pakuła as well, who were the first organizers of the YLMP conference. So as I said yesterday during the opening ceremony, we wish the YLMP to be socially engaged. So this is the third time when the conference includes a YLMP special event. And in this way, we want to show how crucial it is for the academia to remain in dialogue with society and to address various types of social inequalities and injustice, but also to critically approach issues around diversity and inclusion. So issues around tolerance, and here I'm talking about respect, acceptance, and appreciation of broadly defined and approach diversity, have always been close to the Faculty of English, both in terms of research, but also our engagement outside the academia. And such a wonderful example of our social engagement and responsibility is the branch of Bilingualism Matters, that is Bilingualism Matters at Poznań, that aims at increasing awareness about the benefits, but also challenges posed by bi and multilingualism, encouraging policies and practices that promote linguistic diversity as well as bi and multilingual schooling. We are truly delighted that Dr. Maria Coady from the University of Florida kindly accepted our invitation to deliver the YLMP special event lecture this year and share her work with us. Now I'd like to ask Professor Magdalena Wrembel, my colleague from the Faculty of English, but also Deputy Head of Bilingualism Matters at Poznań, to introduce Dr. Coady. Magda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Maria Coady to you all. She's the professor of ESOL and bilingual education at the University of Florida. Her research interests are diverse and they cover a wide range of areas related to multilingual education, including in particular English learner and multilingual students in rural school settings, language and literacy development, education of teachers and school leaders for rural EL students, as well as rural multilingual family engagement. Professor Coady spans across local, national, and international context, and she has carried out her research as well as trained educators in such countries as Ireland, South Africa, Ukraine, China, the United Arab Emirates, or Costa Rica, among others. She has received numerous awards, including those from the Ford Foundation and the Spencer Foundation. Dr. Coady was appointed the prestigious Irving and Rose Fiend Professorship for her leadership and engagement with students who face educational disadvantage. She has been directing a number of grant-funded projects, including, among others, a project on developing English and language literacy through teacher achievement, Project Stella, supporting teachers of English language learners across rural settings, as well as projects involving partnerships with rural multilingual communities and families. Professor Coady has published extensively in prestigious journals such as TESOL Quarterly, International Journal of Multilingualism, Bilingual Research Journal, as well as she published several book chapters and books by, for instance, Multilingual Matters of Springer. And we were extremely happy because Professor Coady has been awarded the Distinguished Chair in Humanities and Social Sciences, and she'll be our Fulbright Professor in the next academic year. So we'll be very happy to welcome you in person, hopefully in the next academic year. And today she'll be talking to us about why place matters in and exclusion of language minoritized students during COVID-19. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Magdalena, and to Joanna, if I may, for inviting me, and for your patience, for everybody, for the time difference and me being here. I'm honored to be here, and it's a great pleasure to know you virtually. And I am really looking forward to getting to meet everybody locally this coming year. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I was also very interested in the conference. It's a fabulous conference and amazing speakers. And I've been able to listen to some of the presentations from where I'm at right now, which is in Florida. So hello from Florida, and congratulations on a job well done in a very engaging conference. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and with you all, and I'll have to just go ahead and build the presentation, put it into presentation mode for you, so you can maybe follow along with some of the ideas that I'd like to present today. And what I would like to really talk about and present is this idea of place and why place does matter in the inclusion and in the exclusion of language minoritized students, particularly recently. So these are very recent data I would like to share with you this afternoon, your time, surrounding COVID-19. So it's a very pressing issue. Our contexts are really different right now. I think I keep saying, thank you, Joe Biden, for we've had a very good rollout of the vaccinations in the United States. And most of us, I think everybody I know in Florida and in my immediate family and community have been fully vaccinated. So that's a good thing. But in the midst of all that, that doesn't mean everybody has had access to vaccinations. And I want to point that out a little bit this afternoon for you here and talk about what's happening and the role of place in this. You'll notice that in this title, I use the terminology of language minoritized students. And that's just to point out that sometimes our students who are bilingual students or English learner students, we are frequently using the terminology here of language minoritized students to really underscore the idea that students themselves are not minorities, that they have been minoritized because of the social structures and the larger narratives around them. So I will use the terminology of language minoritized students, but interchangeably in some of the data here with English learner and in a few places English language learner. I'd like to start with just this idea of place. So why place matters. If we think about place, meet somebody new for the first time, I think it's the third question we ask them. What is your name? What do you do? And where are you from? And the reason I think we do that as humans, as people, is because we understand that place is so integral to our personal identities that we immediately have a connection between who we are as people and the geographic space in which we were raised or the place that we inhabit. And sometimes for many of us, it's multiple places. And so these places become really important to who we are and the way we perceive the world. In other words, our ontology and even our epistemologies, who we are, the way we understand the world around us is very integral to place. But it's curious to me that we don't always think about place more specifically and the way place really is affecting and affects how education works for language minoritized students. And even more poignantly is how place, the role that place plays in teacher and leader preparation programs for language minoritized students. So we have this, I think, a disconnect between the importance of place and identity and sometimes the work that we do. I use the word here, terroir, which is, of course, a French word, in thinking about place. A similar word in Spanish is terruño. And you can see in this picture, it sort of captures, I picked this picture because it captures this notion of place that is more than just a landscape or a backdrop. When we think about, one of my favorite things is wine and the vignoble and the way wine grows. All of the features of the immediate environment, even what you don't see, affects the absolute essence of the wine and ultimately the quality of the wine and how we will interact with the wine when we drink it or smell it. And so you see in this picture that there looks to be an arid community. I think that from the pine trees that are in the medium ground, from the stones and the background of the hillocks of the hills, it's very rocky, and also from the vineyards and the vines in the foreground. There's some scrub in front of them, but you'll notice that the earth has got small stones and it's white. And that's probably purposeful because, as many of you probably know, the stones and the white color will reflect the sunlight onto the backsides of the vine. And so those all play an important role in the wine itself. You think about the humidity, the proximity to the sea, the rain, the climate, other parts of the climate, and even the root structure and the stock of the plant all have a lot to do with the essence of this place. And so this picture captures for me this idea that place really does matter. And it's more than just a backdrop. It's more than just a description of the schools we work in. It has to do with social processes and the social environment in which we as humans live. To continue along a little further in this idea, I like to frame this work as a critical place-based pedagogy and critical place-based education. And this sort of derives from a few scholars who talk about something like geographical blindness in education that has been quite pervasive in the work that many of us do. I think it sort of struck me somewhere around, I'd say about 12 or 14 years ago in my work in Florida, that at the university, we have a strong university, a large university setting, but immediately outside the pale, immediately outside of the immediate environment, we are in a very rural community here. And so in our rural community, we have crop industries like watermelon. It's a warm climate in Florida where I live. So there are palm tree industries. Hay bale is a big industry. Blueberry farms, our first crop blueberries are big here. And so there's sort of this the different geographical spaces that we haven't paid much attention to. There's this sort of geographical blindness that has pervaded education. So much so that teacher education programs, and you may have experienced this, that these teacher education programs, when we prepare teachers for language minoritized students, it's one curriculum, it's one program, it's one placement for them to go to. And so what happens in our work is that we prepare teachers and leaders to work with language minoritized students based on this idea that they're going to a metro or urban centric place. And as soon as they enter a community, it doesn't work. Something for them in their preparation doesn't fit the reality of the community in which they live. And so we think about this as a kind of blindness. To think about it even more, the work of Grunwald has been really helpful here. He talks about a critical pedagogy of place. And this work is grounded very much in the work of Paulo Freire and Conscientiação, where Freire writes that to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take actions against oppressive elements of reality is what he refers to as praxis. So there are two parts of this critical pedagogy of place. It's the perception and understanding of the world around us that would include place. and then to take action against those oppressive elements. And I think those two parts are essential. One without the other doesn't work and won't make the kinds of changes we think are needed for language minoritized students. In this regard, I really want to quote the work of Peter McLaren and Henry Giroux, who write that at the most general level, a critical pedagogy must be a pedagogy of place. It must address the specificities of the experiences, problems, languages, and histories that communities rely upon to construct a narrative of collective identity and possible transformation. And ultimately what they mean by this is that without making sense of the place around us, transformation is just not possible. And I think based on the work and some of the work I see in critical place-based pedagogy, I'd have to agree with their work and their words. But these are dynamic definitions of place. And so the work of Giroux and Freire and Grunwald talk to us about social processes. But when I look back in contrast to that, in the way our work is really guided and some of the ways we must frame our work for things like our federal government and things like our state government and local communities, we have much more static definitions of place. And I want to share with you in this slide a few of those static definitions because maybe they're similar to communities in which you work. Maybe not, but they could be useful as a point of contrast here. In the United States, we use what are called urban-centric definitions of place to guide federal funding and state funding for schools and for teacher education and educational programs. And if you look on the right-hand side, you see this table that consists of the 4 main categories that are city, suburb, town or small town, and rural. So rural is only one of 4 geographic designations. And under each of these, there are 3 sub-designations. So for instance, under city, you see that there are large, mid-size, and small cities. And that makes some sense to me. And you notice that those city definitions are very much predicated on the population. So number of people living in a particular place. And so those numbers change and those define various sizes of cities. Similarly with the category of suburb, that we're sort of predicating those on population, on densities and populations, and that also might make sense. As you move down to the category of town, however, you see that the definitions change a little bit. No longer is it based on population, but it starts being based on distance. And so by distance, I mean that there's a place and it's surrounded by space. Okay, so place and space are sort of part and parcel of the definitions of town and rural communities and rural locales. So here you have fringe, distant, and remote. And when you look down at that definition of rural communities, and these are the communities that I work in most specifically, they have fringe rural communities are somewhat close to an urbanized area, clusters of small cities where they're more populated. Distant, that is further out, is somewhat of a drive to get out there from where I'm living. And then remote rural places are really the most remote, considered geographically, the most remote places in the United States that are more than 25 miles, I guess that's like 50 or 60 kilometers from an urbanized area. So these are quite distant from places where there would be more resources like health resources, food resources, and other kinds of resources that communities need really to survive. Okay, so these are very static definitions of place and space. I'm just circling here this idea of rurality. Okay, now this particular picture in this slide shows what's interesting is the United States Census Bureau definition of rurality. And if you notice on the left, you see the Census Bureau defines rural as any population, housing, or territory not in an urban area. So that is really interesting to me because it seems that there's this binary, a false binary between what is urban and what is rural. And if it's not urban, well, then it must be rural. And we know, certainly from our more dynamic definition, that that really is not the case. But it's the way that a lot of the large national narratives have evolved over time to group and to reify stereotypes of communities that are rural communities in the United States, for sure. The picture on the right you see is a map of the United States. It does not show Hawaii, but it does show a little bit of Alaska in the top left there. What you see here is all of this green space is considered rural place in the United States. So, ironically, you see some pockets, you see cities, New York, Chicago, you see some cities up this way. But this, you can see the vast majority of the landmass, based on this federal definition, would be considered rural. And ironically, rural is supposed to be everything that's just not urban. And I think we're a little more sophisticated than that. But this has really important implications for things in the United States. And we may be unique in this way for things like funding, which is so important to schools and communities and really speaks to equity issues and why in the United States we have very important conversations surrounding equity issues and race issues, as I'm sure you may be hearing in the news in recent months, for sure. I'll talk about that in a minute. So why does rural matter in funding in the United States? Well, I can tell you that we have a very decentralized education system. We have 50 physical states in the United States, as well as numerous territories like Puerto Rico and Guam. But the federal funding accounts for very, very little of the kind of funding that schools need and communities need to survive. So schools in particular, education in particular, federal funding accounts for only 8% of funding that schools receive. And this is probably a deep contrast, a severe contrast to many places around the world that have centralized curriculums and much more federal funding. And we might theorize that's much more equitable funding because of that. You'll notice here that states like Florida is a state provides 47% of funding for kindergarten through grade 12. That's our primary, middle, and secondary educational programs. And local governments, local communities account for about the same, 45%. Those numbers change a little bit, but really the vast majority of funding for schools derives from local property tax and the states. So what happens then in that case when we have local revenues and property tax? Well, I can tell you things like in Florida, agricultural land is taxed at a much, much lower rate than homes are, than properties, homeowner properties and values, much lower. It's taxed lower than businesses and so on. I also want to point out that in the South, in the rural South in the United States, there are a lot of churches. So you see in rural communities, there's agricultural land and some very small numbers of businesses, houses that are not taxed terribly high, but churches that pay no tax on their base at all. So that's one reason why rural communities in the United States are so starved for resources to run schools. And it's inherent and systemic in the way schools are funded in the United States. And we can certainly talk about equity issues surrounding funding. Other things that seem to affect very much rural schools is things like the cost to transport students. So while you have lower funding base and much lower funding income for schools to run, you also have higher costs for gasoline or petrol, the cost of vehicles for those buses to go out and pick up students and bring them in, the cost of drivers for those vehicles. Other things that have really severely affected school under COVID-19 include things like digital connectivity, that's broadband, access to technology. I'll talk about that more deeply in just a few minutes, and things like limited language specialists for language minoritized students, healthcare, social needs, things like that. So what I'm painting here is a picture of issues of equity for rural communities in the United States. On this next slide, if you take a look and see, I put up two maps here, and I actually, when I was looking these numbers up, I had to pause myself. I was taken aback at some of the way these data show up. On the first map on the left, you see I looked up child poverty rates here in the United States. Now, the United States is, by many accounts, a wealthy country. But we have noticed in the United States, in particular in the South, we see lots of child poverty rates. The averages in Florida tend to be almost 25%. So a fifth, to a quarter of our students in the state of Florida are living in high poverty settings. What does that mean? That means for a family of three in the United States, the poverty line was $20,000 of income, more or less. So that is not a lot of money. In some places around the world, $20,000 is a good bit of money for a family for a year. But over the past 4, 5, 6, 7 years, at least notably here, the inflation rate, although it's, we're told the inflation rate is fairly stable, the cost of items to survive for families has gone up tremendously. So a basket of items that you would have bought, food items and so on, 10 years ago has really increased a lot in some communities and across the United States. So it costs more and more to live. So the poverty rates, though, it seems like a high threshold, but in fact, $20,000 is very, very little. So you see here, these are child poverty rates in all the non-metropolitan counties. And again, that binary shows up where you have non-metro and metropolitan counties in the United States. And all of these red areas, as you see, all along the South in the United States, 40% or higher of child poverty rates, absolutely devastating. On the right-hand side, you see these similar locations here, and I circle these. These are areas that have persistent poverty rates. And if you notice, these are from 1980, 1990, 2000, the US Census that's conducted every 10 years, and recent survey data from what's called the American Community Survey looks at these rates, and where those places remain high poverty, that's considered consistent poverty rates. So you see right now that in the southern part of the United States, we have high poverty rates and persistent poverty rates and high child poverty rates, okay? So let me layer this on a little further. We're talking about funding, we're talking about schooling, and we're talking about poverty here right now. Okay. I want to show you in this slide that there have also been demographic changes in rural communities. So we have rural communities that are really showing up across the country. But what you notice really interesting in this particular slide is that between 2000, this dark blue, and 2010, so admittedly somewhat dated data, you see the number of white people has decreased in rural communities, but the number of Hispanics as a percentage of the population has increased significantly. Black people or African-American people, the numbers have gone down proportionately. You see an increase, small increase in the number of Asian background people, and other could be really anything, but sometimes biracial or more than two races show up in this other category as well. We just don't know. I don't know what's in the other category. But what's important here is the Hispanic population that's not all non-English speaking, but significantly non-English speaking or language minoritized population in rural communities, non-metropolitan communities, and the increase in those numbers over time. And again, another map here just to sort of build onto this layer as we move into things like equity, that you see here language minoritized students, now drilling down into the student population where these numbers are large. On the left-hand side, 10 to 25% of students who are language minoritized, these data refer to that as English language learner students. You can see these numbers, the darker colors, all along the South, right? So you see larger numbers of Hispanics in the rural areas. Many of these areas are rural. You see poverty rates in the South, and you see language minoritized students in the South. So you can see what's going on demographically and geospatially in the United States. And again, I think these data might not be directly related to some of the areas in which you all work, but I think there are likely some similarities. I want to point out here that these numbers are a little bit blurry, but the number of school districts in the United States that are rural, considered rural, is about half. So that is a lot of rural school districts, like that green map of the US Census Bureau that I showed you. A lot of communities are considered rural. And the number of schools considered rural under federal designations, those are those categories, is about a third, that has 32%. And the number of students living in rural communities is about a quarter. So half, a third, a quarter are numbers that represent rural schools and communities in the United States. And you see up here this number, about 11% of our language minoritized students attend rural schools. Now, these data are very, very difficult to find because even though we have federal classifications of rurality, those numbers and data sets don't intersect well at all with the data that we use to know how students are doing. So we have a difficult time aligning different data sets, and I think we do have to do a better job of this. By my own estimation, based on these data from the National Center for Educational Statistics in the US, and some other data that have come out a little more recently, suggesting 600,000 students are language minoritized students in the United States in rural communities. I really would argue the number is much, much higher. I would argue around 750,000. And that's because we have not done a good job identifying, using the kinds of assessments we need to identify students and place students and provide them the kinds of language supports that they need in rural communities, okay? So we know other things that happen in rural communities, that high schools, secondary schools offer the lowest number of bilingual programs. That's for sure. We know that only 63% of students participate in instruction that really is meant to meet their language learning needs. So we have a federal government that mandates that students have specialized programs when they are non-native English speakers, but we cannot meet those needs in rural communities. And I think it's actually, these are positive. I think the numbers are really maybe not quite so nice in reality. Now, finally, I want to show you just a few more pieces here, not overwhelm you with data, but just to show you that every 2 years in the United States, we do give an assessment to students. It's called the Nape, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And we look particularly at reading scores and mathematics scores every 2 years in grades 4, 8, and 12. In between those years, we offer other assessments to sort of gain a sense of how students are doing nationally, but these are Nape scores. And what's important in this first picture is that you see that these numbers are, these lines are disaggregated by race. So white, Hispanic doesn't always mean language minoritized, but it's a good indicator or somewhat of a proxy for language minoritized students. That you can see over time from 1992 all the way up to 2019, you know, there's not a real difference in how those scores have changed. So these are categories that are really difficult to improve learning across different racial groups over time. Down below, very recent data from the Nape assessment with scale scores on the left show that between males and females, girls do outperform boys, okay, in the most recent Nape test overall. These are, by the way, 4th grade reading scores. So I selected the 4th grade reading scores. So males and females, you can see low poverty, mid poverty, and high poverty. Just what I was pointing out. Where's the poverty in the United States? Largely in the South, okay? And you can see a significant difference in high poverty settings, we refer to these at 206 in the scale score, we refer to these as Title I communities. They have high poverty communities. And then you see here the ELL, or language minoritized student status, of course, performing the lowest on these disaggregated data. And if you look here, I just circle, if you are language minoritized and living in a high poverty community, you are very unlikely to score well on the national Nape assessment. And we know where those students are, right, from the maps I showed you. Okay, and finally, these are very recent data that I was just able to kind of get a hold of. And what I want to show you on this very dense chart is to just draw your attention down here to the bottom. This was a study conducted by our Migration Policy Institute. It's based in Washington, DC, and you all have a Migration Policy Institute in Brussels that provide data across Europe and do some really good things, are very reliable data sources. Notice that they do use this terminology here, LEP, that's Limited English Proficient. It's a very old designation. It means similar to language minoritized students, but when we say limited English, we don't really like to use that terminology because it really is quite pejorative, telling people how limited they are or describing people as limited in any way. So what they did, though, at the Migration Policy Institute was look at parents who were language minoritized, low income, and have very little educational background, no high school diploma, that's our secondary leaving certificate equivalent. And look what these data show very recently when they have school-aged children and they're born outside of the United States. The characteristic is that they have more than a quarter don't have access to the internet. That includes, by the way, their cell phone device. Okay, so people can access on their cell phone, which is mostly what they would do as opposed to having access from the home. But notice here that these households, almost half of them don't have access to a computer. Now, I'm sharing this because we're moving into this part of talking about equity to education during COVID-19. And there is a lot to say about what has happened in the past 2 recent years. Language minoritized students' achievement by locale, those designations I mentioned, rural, small town, suburban, and urban. Do we know how those students are doing? No, we don't. I have asked the federal government and asked even at the state level across various states. We do not disaggregate the data by this way, and it's difficult for us as scholars to do our work. And it's also difficult for us to build an argument as to why we need to reverse funding streams when we don't have access to the data, but we do not know how language minoritized students are doing in school based on rural, small town, urban, and suburban categories. Okay, so some of the challenges now, thinking about what's happening in terms of COVID, we have found that rural communities, of course, characterized by higher levels of poverty, I've shown that, and fewer job opportunities, very much dependent on things like large industry shifts. So for example, when the fracking industry or mining industries have shifted across the country, language minoritized families or immigrant families will go to those places and then move again. They're very vulnerable to things like harvest seasons and mobility shifts as well, making access to consistent education quite difficult for those families. They're vulnerable to labor markets, vulnerable to access to healthcare. I think I'm missing an H there under the healthcare and social services. So those are things that we have a hard time providing to those communities. And then I will tell you that since COVID-19 the pandemic has affected all of us in such severe ways, and we're suffering every day from these, and many of us have lost family members to COVID-19, that these disparities for rural communities have been heightened, so much so that it's been real tragic to see the way schools and communities have had to respond to the needs of children and families in these communities. So things like reliance on telehealth. By telehealth, I mean where families or individuals can call their doctor on the telephone and maybe log on to a screen and share their healthcare needs. So there's been a reliance on telehealth, but again, in rural communities, they may not have access to some of those telehealth technologies. Need to support health compromised populations. So in rural communities, as I mentioned, we do have blueberry crops, palm tree industries, we have healthcare, harvest industries and food like watermelon, peanut industry is right down the road here. So those populations have become what we call our essential workers in the United States. But again, these are communities that might not be documented, that are working in the fields, that don't have access to healthcare. And so when COVID-19 hit, what we found was those communities were still out in the field without personal protective equipment, without masks, without access to healthcare, and they were exposed to COVID-19 in disproportionate kinds of ways. And of course, access to vaccinations, which we're rolling out as quickly as possible here, has also been very difficult in rural communities. So these are just off the top some of the challenges. I would be remiss, however, not to talk about the strengths of rural communities. And rural communities that I've worked with, we know are increasingly diverse, racially diverse, ethnically diverse, and linguistically diverse. And that I see as a tremendous strength. I think we have not paid enough attention to racial diversity in bilingual programs and in bilingual communities as we should have. And I think with the Black Lives Matters movement in the United States, we have benefited a lot from people taking a critical examination of the role of race in schools and the role of race in bilingual communities. So that's been very good, very important. Other strengths in rural communities have been the funds of knowledge and how people understand communities function and the strengths of how they work together as a community when they face social and economic and even natural disaster challenges like hurricanes and other things that happen. Rural communities are resilient. They tend to bind together when there are tragedies in the communities, and things like schools become center points as funeral homes. So sadly, about 2 years ago in our local community, there was a young girl who was from a poor family, was riding one of the ATVs, all-terrain vehicles, without a helmet and without constraint on it, and it flipped over and the girl, this young girl, died. It was very tragic. The community was very upset, and the family did not have money for funeral homes and a place to go. And so the school, of course, becomes a place where the community gets together and holds funeral services when those events, tragic events, happen. So there are many strengths in rural communities. I'm going to share just a minute of one teacher from a research study that I've conducted, and what she says about her own community. It is Williston, Florida, and you see where this green area, that is a county where she lives. I'm right in the next county over in Alachua County. This county is called Levy County, and this is a 4th grade teacher who's describing her community and what's so good about it.
Williston is the type of community you want when you're raising a family. It's a community where people are supportive, they get to know you, they're involved in your life. They come together as a community for all different types of events. It's a community where you know if other people come into contact with your child, they're going to also do their best to be a positive influence on them. And so as a mother, I chose to stay in Williston because I wanted my family raised in that kind of atmosphere. As a teacher, I love the type of support system that you have. I have relationships with the parents of my students that go beyond the classroom. We'll see each other at sporting events or at church events or community events like the parade and stop and have conversation. We see each other in the grocery store almost every week. So it's just a community where people love each other. They're supportive of one another. They get involved in each other's lives, and they remain part of each other's lives even after that initial moment of contact.
Right. So she's got something to say, and I think a lot of good things to say about where she works and her commitment to the community. I'd like to share just a few more slides here so you see how COVID-19 has really affected rural communities based on very recent data that we have, that we know. This was a study conducted by Mueller and McConnell. Just last year, they surveyed more than 1,000 rural communities, members of rural communities, to learn how COVID-19 has affected them. And what they found was that there was a real negative effect on COVID-19 on their overall well-being in the community, their overall lifestyle and their overall well-being. And so that probably is not terribly surprising because it's been a devastating pandemic. And again, particularly in rural communities, particularly in poor rural communities. But if you notice, you go over a few more bars over here, you'll see that people are really suffering in terms of their mental health. Not so much in their physical health, which is a bit surprising to me, but the mental health has really taken a toll, and accessing mental health supports for rural communities has also been difficult. Teachers, similarly, like Becky Childs, has said that they've seen the impact of COVID-19 on the mental health of those children. And so I want to mention what they've had to do about it as well. So negative effect of COVID-19. And just to reinforce this point a little bit is that what happened with COVID-19 was we realized very quickly in this country that rural communities did not have access to broadband. We call it the digital connectivity or digital connectivity divide. Starting in March of 2020, schools were closed down, they closed their doors, and teachers were absolutely not prepared to especially rural teachers, not prepared to move into an online platform. They didn't have access to online materials. And more importantly, even if they did, because they could access computers at school, the students that were so far away did not have access to broadband. And in those homes that had multiple children in the homes, they maybe had, as you saw, 27%, maybe 47%, maybe had a computer. But all children, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, at the same time needed to be on the computer at the same time. It was absolutely devastating. So what did they resort to doing? Well, this table shows a little bit about what they resorted to do. By this, you can see that the schools in rural communities used paper resources. And so these are here on this side. I think I circled this here. Yeah, you can see that those communities less than $50,000 in the household were more likely to have paper materials sent home. What does that mean? That means that teachers, down the road, teachers were going into school, putting together worksheets and paper packets, they call them paper packets, stapling them together, putting them on the buses, and the bus drivers were going out and dropping off paper materials to students to do those materials at home. And then the parents and the kids had to come back to the school and drop them off for the teachers to grade them. Did the teachers grade them? No. Most of those paper materials were not able to be finished by the students. And this was in 2020. And so the teachers used those paper materials just to check off that the students were attended school, just for attendance reasons. And did those students attend school? No, they really didn't attend school. 30 million people in the United States today are still considered to be without high-speed access and broadband to access learning. 35% of the rural population, and again, 93% of US households stated during COVID that they had some sort of distance learning. By distance learning, I mean both online resources and paper materials, resources that didn't happen at the school were considered distance materials. And then finally, I want to show what happened visually in 2020. So in 2020, And I know our time is coming here shortly, but in 2020, you see the students here were going to McDonald's to access internet when they lived in rural communities. Over here, you see in the bottom right, these were some secondary students. This picture was taken from Washington State, but even here in Florida, right down the road, the high school students realized that they weren't going to school, so they went and worked out on fields to pick it happened to be blueberry season here. They were working to make money for their families. That's what they were doing. This picture above, you can see this is an example of the families had to come in and drop off their paper packets when the kids did the work in 2020. And then these are two teachers on the lower left here. What they were doing was they were giving out food. There was a food line, you had to stay in your car, and the teachers packed lunches. That's what their teaching looked like in 2020. Did it change in 2021, this past year? Very recently, yes. It changed because kids were given in September, when they went back to school, August, September, they were given 4 options or sometimes 5 options to go to school fully online, part-time in the school, that's 1 day in school, 1 day out of school. Some students got virtual schooling where it was completely online. Usually that was a company that provided that. And then here's what happened in the rural schools. The schools, by October of 2020, the principal said, we struggled the first quarter, the first 9 weeks of school to keep up with everyone and make sure that they were safe. Luckily, we have almost all of our kids back in school now. In other words, the rural response was, we have to get kids back into a physical school. Then we know they have access to healthcare. We know they have access to food. We know they have access to language programs, and we know that they're physically safe. And that's what happened in Florida. And finally, I just want to go back to this idea of the inherent structural inequities and the exclusion of rural language minoritized students from programs overall in the United States. They are students who might not speak English as a first language, but those who live in the South, US South, have high levels of poverty, persistent poverty, low access to resources, less prepared teachers for linguistic diversity, and very, if none, no bilingual programs. During COVID, these were our healthcare workers, essential workers, and again, they still face immigration issues. We'll see if we can deal with immigration reform this year. They're least likely to have access to digital connectivity. And then just by way of ending here and bringing us back to this idea of critical place-based education, I think there's the argument here that place does matter in education. I think it's pretty evident, at least using these data, that place needs to be it needs to shape and frame the work we do. If we don't, I don't see how we will ever really address issues of equity, at least in the United States, when we have tremendous funding disparities across places in the country. And I'm sure that you may have questions. I'm happy to answer them, but I want to point out in this picture, this was a community that we worked in. And for those of you that speak Spanish, El 20 de marzo, it says Liberación Temprana. This was a community that was trying so hard to provide some outreach to families in Spanish. This is supposed to say early release day from school. The children get out of school early that day. It was a Wednesday. And I think the literal translation is more about salvation, early salvation. But it's a really interesting example of how rural communities might not have linguistic resources to beyond sometimes Google Translate, right? But are making efforts in ways that they can to meet the needs of their language minoritized students, given all of the inherent inequities that they face. So I'll stop sharing now and be really happy to hear what you all have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Professor Coady, for your insightful thought and presentation and lecture. And we're really grateful for your sharing insights into this challenging situation. And we do greatly sympathize, right, with the how devastating the effect of COVID has been, right? Especially for language minoritized students. And I'm sure we would like to share also our experiences. So I do invite anybody to ask questions by raising your hands, or if you'd rather, you can also use the chat option, but I would encourage the audience to ask questions. Maybe if I may ask the first one, if you don't mind. I've been wondering, because towards the end you mentioned there are no bilingual programs, which really struck me, right? In such a bilingual community, right, or multilingual community as we're faced with in the US, I just could hardly believe it, because I was going to ask about some examples of best practices in terms of multilingual educational policy, if you would be able to share with us some examples of inclusive educational programs, but they seem to be limited, right, from what you were saying.
Right. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I agree. So there have been tremendous growth in the number of bilingual dual language immersion programs across the entire country. And it's been really dependent on funding from specific states and state policies in many places. I don't want to say that there are really no dual language or transitional bilingual programs in rural communities, but really not in Florida for sure. So where in 1963, Florida had the first publicly funded two-way immersion program. We can talk about program models later, but in 1963, by 1988, Florida declared English as its official language. And so the state has really hidden behind this policy, even as recently as 2018 with its state plan to the federal government. Now, it's problematic because we have the third largest numbers of language minority English learner students in the entire country, and are in the South, where students and families are, not just Spanish speakers, but Haitian Creole speakers, close proximity to Haiti, and Portuguese speaker, obviously Vietnamese speakers, many speakers in the States, very diverse. But the state is not providing support for bilingual programs. That said, by grassroots efforts in more suburban areas, and not even small towns, suburban and urban areas, we have more than 100, 120 or so dual language programs in Florida. So rural communities have been really left out of this conversation. At the same time, you did mention, though, inclusive best practices. And at the same time, the state, like Florida, has mandated preparation for teachers to work with language minoritized students. So that preparation looks like an inclusive classroom where they have students with special learning needs, English learners, and the teacher must learn to differentiate instruction for language ability levels. So beginning level students. So there is some preparation for that in inclusive classroom settings. I can tell you it's not terribly effective, but there are really no bilingual programs, not in Florida, in rural communities, and very, very few bilingual programs across the country.
Quite surprising, right? So yeah, this is quite surprising. So it's like majority language promoted, right? Rather than,
right, that's right, that's right. Official English means promoting English, even if it's not the most effective. I mean, we know it's just time on task is not an effective strategy.
Thanks so much. Right.
Maybe I'll.
Yes, Yasha.
Okay. Thank you so much, Maria, for your very inspiring talk also, and giving us a chance to really make some comparisons. And my question is really more kind of a reflection thought, or it'd be great if you could share some of your thinking around it. So we often talk about so-called post-pandemic, world, or in this case, education, what it's going to be like. And I'm wondering, as an expert, at education, what do you envisage as the biggest challenges when it comes to post-pandemic education in general?
Yeah, so I think, thank you for the question. And I think that schools are not going to look the same as they did before. You probably all feel something similar, because what we're talking about here is, now, let me back up. The state and many states, most states, have mandated testing this year. So we're a country where we've been complaining for many years that we're over testing our students, and it's beyond the Nape. You know, there's state assessments and language assessments, and it just goes far and deep. It's just so much. Last year, the state did not assess because the kids were not in school. Our kids were out in fields, you know, but this year the state said, well, we must assess all of the children. So what we're imagining is when we get those test scores back over the summer in English language proficiency levels and content area instruction, that we'll see learning losses. Now, I'm saying learning losses, but we know that kids have also learned a lot. They might not have made academic gains, but these children are learning to survive in a pandemic. And for many of them, it has been very, very difficult. So they have really struggled as well themselves. So immediate post-pandemic, I'd say it's going to take a lot of communities coming together and educators coming together to figure out where kids are really at and how to reconfigure educational programs and practices based on a wide range of learning ability levels. I was at a school not long ago because I said we're open now, like the rural schools had to open back up. And I was with a third grade teacher who came into the main office, and she was in tears crying. And and you know, not to be dramatic, but the teacher was very upset. She said, I wanted to teach third grade because I didn't want to have to teach children how to write their names again. And I am in third grade teaching children how to write their names again and teaching children how to tie their shoes. So teachers are also very much affected by the changes that they're facing. We're arguing here in the United States that we've had children, in language education have frequently worked with students with limited, interrupted formal education, because kids come from Central America and they have had many months without formal education, if not years. We're arguing now that every child in America has had interrupted formal education. And so that is changing immediately what's going to happen coming back this next academic year. But I think in the long run, it's highlighting the disparities that we're seeing. You know, again, I like President Biden. I'll be honest. I think he's already done some tremendously good things in our country. But one thing he has done is put the America Cares Act out, and specific funding is coming right down to rural schools and communities. So it's going to come over the summer, funding from the federal government. So it'll change those numbers of federal support, not stopping at the state level, but coming straight down to schools, and for 3 years. So schools will have more funding. And so I think in the medium term, and maybe in the longer term, we may be able to gain some ground in terms of rural communities and educational equity issues.
Thanks. I like what you said. You know, we just have to know where we are, you know. But also, I mean, just one more comment. What comes to my mind is that actually pandemic is really socially stratified. Like that it just means so different, right? Depending on, you know, where you're coming from and your background, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Although, you know, it's, you know, they just kept saying that pandemic doesn't care who you are. I mean, in one sense, yes, but in terms of social consequences or ramifications, it very much does. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We have a comment on chat, so let me read that. It's from Leonie. Thanks for this insightful talk. I'd like to point to research by Zaretsky et al., who found correlations between language screening outcomes in preschoolers, which are a good prediction of school performance, and the place they live in, as well as other social, linguistic, and demographic variable. And there is a link provided to the research gate, yes, that Leonie is sharing with us.
Oh, excellent. That's excellent. I've already clicked on it and anxious to download it. Yes, and I'd like to learn more about the kinds of language screening. I should say, I only very recently learned, you know, being a scholar in the US for 30 or so years, more maybe, only recently learned within the past month that in Florida, it seems to be a widespread practice when young children, so we're talking pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, are being screened and identified for language services, which we want to do, that the school districts have only been assessing them in oral language proficiency. This has come out because of a situation with a particular school district I've only just learned about. So when those children, for example, are screened for oracy, and they are deemed proficient in English, which they might be, they're not given an early literacy assessment. They're not given an emergent literacy or reading writing assessment. And what I'm learning is that we have not misidentified students who should otherwise qualify for services, support services, when they have not been systematically excluded. So I think that we're still grappling with this. I'm really anxious to read this paper. Thank you for sharing about language screening in preschoolers.
Thanks so much. Any further questions or comments? You're more than welcome to address them. Maybe just a brief comment also when you were talking about the digital connectivity divide. This is a similar situation that we've been experiencing in Poland. I'm not aware of the exact numbers, statistics. I'm not sure we have them concerning our rural areas. But the situation you described with the paper materials being sent home, delivered, this was the very much same thing happening, right? With postmen delivering to some rural communities, yes. And probably no grading or no returning back was almost possible. But yes, we've heard that. Yes, it's situations like that in Poland, definitely.
Are your students back in physical school in Poland?
Just the lower grades, grade 1 to 1, 2, 3, and the kindergartens, they back, but not the upper grades. They expected to go back, but we're not quite sure, right? And this will happen. So it's only the lower grades who are back. Yeah. Right. For the moment, oh yes, and only in part of the country, yes, and in a hybrid form, yes. This is a comment from Justina. This is true because some parts of the country which are more affected, some provinces, the schools have not reopened. Yes, and there is a hybrid form. True. A week in, week out.
Wow.
So yes, this is what we're experiencing. In universities have not, students have not been back. Just some exceptions have been made to lab classes or something, but majority not. Okay. I guess we'll have time also to continue maybe more informal chats and conversation on the platform during the social gathering on the Gather Town platform to which we are invited. So let me thank the speaker again. Maria, thanks so much for this insightful talk, and we're really happy to have you with us. And there's lots of applauding around, as you can see, if not here.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank
Yes,
you.
and we hope to see you all on the social gathering platform, right?